We've seen so far that God made the world. He made everything. Everything belongs to him. He's the ruler. He's in charge. We've also seen that God made us to rule the world under him. That's why he made us in his image, to think and speak, to relate and create in a way that honours him and obeys him, but is also good for the world that he's put us in charge of. But what we're going to see today is that the first man and the first woman, Adam and Eve, they didn't do what God made them to do. Rather than ruling the world under God and for him, they chose instead to rule away from God and for themselves. In order to explain that, I'm going to need to tell you about two trees. God has placed Adam in a garden that is paradise. And we pick it up in chapter 2, verse 9. The Lord God made all kinds of trees grow out of the ground, trees that were pleasing to the eye and good for food. In the middle of the garden were the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So lots of trees, but two in particular, a tree of life and a tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Eat from the tree of life, an opportunity to live forever. Eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Well, it's an opportunity to decide for themselves what is right and what is wrong, what is good and evil, apart from God. And then God says in verse 16, "And the Lord God commanded the man, 'You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For when you eat from it, you will certainly die.'" And that makes sense. It's not for humans to decide what is right and wrong, what is good or evil. That's for God to decide. That's for him to say. So to disobey God on this would spell disaster. Humans, remember, are meant to rule under God and for him, not away from him, making their own decisions. That leads to death. Well, we might know the story. God makes Eve, and then Adam and Eve together, they choose to disobey God. They eat from the tree that God commanded them not to eat, from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so here's what they've done. Having been given the choice of life forever with God in paradise under his rule, or life without God, ruling themselves, deciding for themselves what is right and wrong, well, Adam and Eve, they've chosen to be in charge. They've chosen to disobey God's rule. They've chosen to live by their own rule and just go without God. That's what sin is, that Bible word. It's when a person thinks they know better than God. It's when someone thinks that ruling in this world under God and for him, what they were made to do, well, it's just not worth doing. That they choose instead to live under their own rule and for themselves. So sin is something that has been in people ever since that fateful day in the Garden of Eden. It's actually something that's in each of us because we're all attached to Adam. And that's easy to notice because if we're honest, given the choice of a life forever with God and under his rule, or of being in charge of our life ourselves, well, we have all chosen in our own way, just like Adam and Eve did. It was such a good start. God made the world. God made us in his image to rule under him. But we've seen today, from the very first man, we want to rule without God. It may be that we've never thought of living outside of God's rule, deciding for ourselves how we want to live is that bad. But I hope we've realised today that it really is. It's really bad. It's really wrong. It's denying what we were made for. It's disobeying the good and generous God who has made us, kicking him out so that we can rule ourselves. And that is the terrible consequence, as God said, the terrible consequence of death. But there's hope. God has not given up on us. We're going to hear about his plan tomorrow.